Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. And I am meeting you once again with lecture 21 of Drama 2, that is modern drama. Well, the good news about this lecture is that we are done with our third text of modern drama, that is Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett. A kind of heavier drama comparatively. So today's talk is going to be a conclusive talk on Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett, and we will be starting our new play with new playwright. We will start with George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion today. So let us conclude with Waiting for Godot first. We started Waiting for Godot in lecture 14 and we ended up with that in lecture 20. So it almost took 6 of the lectures. We will be touching upon all these texts once again towards the end of this course, but what we did in lecture 14, I tried to introduce you with the writer and the play overall. I discussed with you the biography of the writer Samuel Beckett, overview of his writing before Waiting for Godot, and then characters in this very drama Waiting for Godot, what is the setting of the play, a general overview of theatrical concepts and style that writer made use of. And then we moved on with discussing the summary of the plot, and we tried to analyze both of the acts separately as far as the discussion was concerned. And then it moved on to the next lecture, and where we also discussed some worth discussing questions that can be aspects to be analyzed critically. This made us discuss the drama as a masterpiece of the theatre of absurd, and we discussed the dialogue and the language of the drama, the use of humor, the drama as a combination of tragedy and comedy as tragicomedy, and we discussed the plot and structure of the absurdist drama in general and tried to analyze all those components in Waiting for Godot. Then we started with our themes in the drama Waiting for Godot, and we considered all those aspects which would help us understand themes in detail. The rest of 2 lectures basically were all about the different literary devices used in the play, the symbolism, imagery, themes, genre, tone, style, title, and how the tragic plot is basically overwhelming in this drama, although it's a tragicomedy, and then what was the social significance and acceptance of this play. The social significance and acceptance of this play was basically discussed in relation with the plot, setting, drama, language, characters, dramatic directions, and then this philosophical background, this philosophical triangle of theatre of absurd, existentialism, and the paradox of consciousness. And then we try to analyze the characters along as well, so to understand these themes in detail, how they are embedded in each and every component of the drama. And in the end we try to categorize these themes differently in 3 different categories to see how they are representing different aspects of society, whether it's we try to categorize them as social themes, psychological themes, and religious themes, because we understand that Beckett's drama is basically concerned about these 3 major aspects of the modern society of 20th century. And in the end we try to collect dramatical references to substantiate our understanding, to attach and add into its weightage, so we are able to, whatever we are saying, we are able to find a proof from the drama and give a reference where it is due. So that was all about Waiting for Godot, and in the end we were able to understand that basically Waiting for Godot is a drama that talks about 3 major themes. One is waiting, an ongoing endless waiting. The second is of nothingness, and the third is of timelessness of life, the fatality of the actions in life. Basically all these 3 major themes again center on the theme of nothingness in the play, that is very strongly projected by the writer Samuel Beckett, who is highly known for his art of absurdity and existentialism in his writing, and this play Waiting for Godot is considered one of his best writings belonging to this genre of art. Alright, so this makes us finish with the third text and start with the fourth text of the drama, the fourth writer of the drama, George Bernard Shaw. Before that, we start with the George Bernard Shaw's masterpiece, Pygmalion, that is reflection of one masterpiece, mythological masterpiece, Pygmalion. We need to understand very few things about George Bernard Shaw's life, because we understand that a drama is not a reflection of writer's time. It keeps traces of writer's life as well, because a writer cannot be detached from his production, his or her production. So understanding George Bernard Shaw, his time was from 1856 to 1950. And he was the third and youngest child of the family and the only son of the family of George Carr Shaw and Elizabeth Gurley Shaw. Well, technically he belonged to the Protestant ascendancy, the landed Irish gentry, but his impractical father was first a secured civil servant and then an unsuccessful grain merchant. So this gives us an idea of his domestic atmosphere, where he had his early brought up, and then their social status, because this has a big lot of deal with the writer's thoughts that he embeds into his or her writings. So George Bernard Shaw basically grew up in an atmosphere of genteel poverty. You can call it a kind of a mediocre family, a white-collar family who are recognized as gentle people, who are recognized as well-off people. However, they are somehow living in a covered poverty situation, so they can well be known as white-collar people, which to him was more humiliating than being merely poor. And this middle class morality was writer's prime dilemma, not the dilemma of the time that he observed, but the dilemma of the time that he experienced himself as well. Another historical point that may have some importance is that in 1872, his mother left her husband and took her two daughters to London, following her music teacher, George John Lee, who from 1866 had shared households in Dublin with the Shaws. So another kind of twist in George Bernard Shaw's life, we will have to see whether it has to do with the Pygmalion, his writing, or not. And this twist was that in 1872, so if we are quickly able to calculate his age, if he was born in 56, and then in 1872, almost in the age of 15 or 16, his mother left him alone with his father, and she took her two daughters along, following another man who initially joined this family in Dublin, Shaw's, and he happened to be a music teacher for the lady in the house, for George Bernard Shaw's mother. But later on, she kind of made her new family with this person. So in a certain age, in his blooming age, we can see that Bernard Shaw kind of faced a situation which was not very pleasing for the family. So he faced a broken family situation where he did not live very close to his mother. So if we find any kind of specific female, specific gender specific attitudes of male towards female, we may have some clue over here in his own relationship with his mother. So whatever we may feel about this, it shows him close to an exceptionally independent woman. So we see that just after 4 years of this incident in 1876, Shaw resolved to become a writer, since he had to give himself a kind of outlet. So he had chosen writing a kind of medium for his catharsis. And he joined his mother and elder sister, the younger one having died in London. Shaw in his 20s suffered continuous frustration and poverty. And now we are becoming more clear about Shaw's social status. He depended upon his mother's £1 a week earning from her husband and her earnings as a music teacher. So what kind of poverty, what kind of social status he lived in is very much clear by this, that he was kind of dependent at the age of 20 when he was a kind of struggling writer. He depended upon his mother's £1 a week salary, and which he would again get from her husband and then from her earnings as a music teacher. So he spent his afternoons in the British Museum reading room, writing novels and reading what he has missed at school, and his evenings in search of additional self-education in the lectures and debates that characterized contemporary middle-class London intellectual activities. So that was the kind of knowledge exposure and the self-grooming exposure that Shaw had in his 20s. His fiction failed utterly. When he tried with fiction, writing fiction, this failed utterly. The semi-autobiographical and aptly titled Immaturity, published in 1930, repelled every publisher in London from Shaw's writing. So as far as fiction is concerned, he found that this was not his field. So his next 4 novels were similarly refused, and he was not a struggling writer. He very soon in his career he became kind of a failure, as were most of the articles he submitted to the press for a decade. Shaw's initial literary work earned him less than 10 shillings a year. After a fragment posthumously published as an unfinished novel in 1958, but written in 1887 and 88, was his final false start in fiction. So as far as fiction is concerned, Shaw did not really do well in this field. And despite his failure as a novelist in the 1880s, Shaw found himself during this decade, he became a vegetarian, a socialist, a spellbinding orator, a polemicist, and a tentatively a playwright as well. So this was a kind of development that took place in Shaw's personality, and these were some of the reasons behind his development. Before long, Shaw had become one of the most sought after public speakers in England. So he became very famous kind of orator. He argued in his pamphlets in favor of equality of income and advocated the equitable division of land and capital. So he was kind of writer like many others who talked about the equality of public. He believed that property was theft and felt, like Karl Marx, that capitalism was deeply flawed and was unlikely to last. Unlike Marx, however, Shaw favored gradual reform over revolution. However, one difference that makes him different from others, that he did not believe in revolution, however in gradual reformation. So here he stands along with others of the era who dislike war. And there we see Eliza Doolittle, common dust man. And we see Eliza Doolittle, the character in the play Pygmalion, a kind of sharing resemblance with what Shaw believed about these things. So in one pamphlet written in 1897, he predicted that socialism will come by prosaic installments of public regulation and public administration enacted by ordinary parliaments, varsities, municipalities, parish councils, school boards, etc. And one of his pamphlets, he talked about the public regulations, that how will these come, and he talked about these different mediums, that these will become the channels of this kind of transformation. And in 1892, Shaw wrote his first play, Widows' Houses, about the evils of slumlords. The play was attacked savagely by people who opposed his politics. So it was then that Shaw knew he was a good playwright. It was then that he understood that his strength in writing probably is not fiction but in real drama. He must have been to have upset so many people with his social commentary that he did in the drama. However, he went on to revolutionize the English theatre by concentrating his writing on various social issues at a time when most other playwrights were writing sentimental paps. So we understand at a point in modern drama where after very black kind of realism revealed in front of audience, slowly and gradually drama moved towards sentimental pap. However, Bernard Shaw, who was a famous and highly praised orator and who really looked into politics and looked into the social issues with a critical eye and would also talk about it, comment about it, slowly and gradually he found out that his strength in writing does not relate very close with fiction. However, he is the one who can really throw a spotlight on the reality, and that he got to know when he wrote his first play, Widows' Houses. And now we talk about his masterpiece Pygmalion, and there is a myth behind the play. Now what is the myth behind this play? Let us explore together. There is never any overt reference in the play to Pygmalion. Shaw assumes a classical understanding. So it's because the very play, the very title, the very name of the play is basically an allusion with A, that tells us that it has a kind of mythological reference attached. And as to Shaw, he does not in black and white talk about this mythology in his play. However, we understand that he would assume that it's a classical understanding and people will know about it. And why would he use this mythology in the play? One reason can be that we've already discussed why we were doing Juno and the Peacock is people interest in Greek mythology, because prior to this era, the dramas which were enacted and which were written by these writers, they were heavily based on their roots in Greek mythology. So to attract people's attention and to captivate their interest, where you are basically trying to sugarcoat reality, mythology was used as an other kind of colorful, attractive kind of wrap that Shaw, like other writers of the modern era, used to in order to attract the audience. So according to the mythological guide, Pygmalion saw so much to blame in women that he came at last to abhor the relation with them. Pygmalion was an artist and he kind of hated women, and he was very against of this relation between man and women, and he hated the most the kind of emotional reliance that men have over women, and resolved to live unmarried. So he decided he will never ever get into this relationship. He was a sculptor and had made with wonderful skill a statue of ivory, so beautiful that no living woman could be compared to it in beauty. And by profession, by art, by skill, he was a sculptor, the person who shapes a kind of a statue. And although he hated women so much, but what he created a statue of a woman. And it was a statue of ivory, and it was such a beautiful statue that no woman of the time could compare its beauty. And it was indeed the perfect semblance of a maiden that seemed to be alive and only prevented from moving by modesty. Well, this was a kind of masterpiece of Pygmalion's art. She was such a fine blend of beauty that he created. His art was so perfect that it concealed itself, and its product looked like the workmanship of nature. So the myth says that his art was so perfect that it looked like a kind of creation of the creator. Well, Pygmalion admired his own work, and he somehow was kind of person who would really admire his work if he would think that is worth admiring. And at last he becomes a narcissist. At last he falls in love with the perfect kind of artistic living example that he created, and this with the counterfeit creation of Pygmalion, he fell in love with his own creation. Oftentimes he laid his hand upon it as if to assure himself whether it were living or not, and could not even then believe that it was only ivory. First, that he fell in love with his own creation. Secondly, it was such a deep kind of association and love for the statue that now he would wonder if it is just a statue or not a living human being or a living woman. The festival of Venus was at hand, and a festival celebrated with great pomp at Cyprus. Victims were offered, the altars smoked, and the odor of incense filled the air. So it was a kind of a festival celebration that would take place at Cyprus, and this was called as Festival of Venus. When Pygmalion had performed his part in the solemnities, he stood before the altar and timidly said, very shyly he stated, "Ye gods, who can do all things, give me, I pray you, for my wife." The person who hated womanhood, who hated this emotional reliance on women, and for that sake he decided he will remain unmarried his life, he is praying to gods, "Oh God, you are the one who listens to, and you are the one who gives everything. So I pray you for my wife." He dared not say my ivory virgin, but said instead, "One like my ivory virgin." Venus, who was present at the festival, heard him. So it's a myth that the god he prayed to heard him. And while he stands astonished and glad, though doubting and fears he may be mistaken, again and again with a lover's ardor he touches the object of his hopes. It was indeed alive, and the gods heard his prayers, and they gave life to the ivory statue. The veins were pressed, yielded to the finger, and then resumed their roundness. So it's a kind of imagery used here, that he would touch the statue's veins, and they would get pressed and would come back to the roundness of the shape. Then at last the Venus found words to thank the goddess and pressed his lips upon his lips as real as his own. So we see that mythology explains how he kind of thanked the gods and goddesses of his time, whom he prayed to for his wish to come true, and how he expressed his gratitude and joy after that. So one of the most popular plays of Bernard Shaw, first performed in 1913 in Vienna and published and performed in London in 1916, is Pygmalion, and this is based on the myth that I just shared with you from Mythology Guide, and you can get to read it yourself if you would want to. So this tells us that since the myth of Pygmalion has, although it's a kind of protest against men's reliance over women, and then we see that it's a kind of total romance between the sculpture and his art. Do we have this romance in the play as well? So this question, is it a romance? Shaw says no, it's not a romance. However, the text says yes, the plot says yes. So when we will study it together, we will try to make some sense out of it, whether we find this, whether we see this as a romance or not. So let us move to the contextual background of the play. Pygmalion is set in London, England, around the beginning of the 20th century. So during this time in 20th century in London, working class people like Eliza Doolittle. Eliza Doolittle is the protagonist of the play, a female character. They would live in slums, in poverty. They had no heat or hot water. They would bear the cold attitude of people as well as of nature. They had to put coins in a meter to get electric light. This was a kind of social status segregation that they were facing, that elite class were to enjoy the luxuries of life. However, people like these who would live in slums will have to put coins into meter to get electric light, and one thing that they would not have is the coins, the money. So how easily accessible these necessities of life would then be for them is a question that Pygmalion, that is asked by Bernard Shaw in the play. And then we find that there is this divide. The class structure in England at this time was very rigid. No class, no structure was to intermingle with the other. There was a clear segregation, upper class segregation, middle class segregation, and working class segregation. And each segregated class is like into watertight compartment. They could not intermingle. Right. So the government did not provide any schooling. However, an education did not teach the proper speech that was considered a sign of the upper class. Now, if government provided some of the schooling, they will not provide the kind of education which will teach the accuracy, the language of the time, because the language of the time was deeply associated with the eliteness, the upper class authority. So the language was the sign of the class. So this language was not accessible by the people who could not afford that kind of education. So the education that would be provided by the government would be education where they are on purpose prevented for learning this kind of language and good quality of education. Are we not feeling that this is the kind of situation we are facing in Pakistan these days? However, let's see and see that what Pygmalion has to offer us, to see into it, look into it. The way that many working class people spoke was an obstacle to their becoming middle class. So when I say that there is a clear segregation, status segregation, these three stratas are clearly different classes, and then they are not to intermingle. So this control of they do not intermingle was a kind of control where language plays very important role. How could they not be intermingled? And one can question that if they would want, why could not they mix up with the other class? Well, language was one refraining aspect, because the language this working class would speak would not be understandable by the middle class. The language that middle class would speak would not be very much understandable by the elite class. So language kind of played the significant role in keeping these classes separated. All right, and this powerful and significant role of language that it plays in keeping classes apart is basically the central theme of the play. In Greek mythology, Pygmalion was a gifted young sculptor, as I just discussed, who resolved never to marry. But after Pygmalion created a statue of a beautiful woman, he fell in love with the statue. And he got miserable because he loved a lifeless object. He appealed to Aphrodite, the goddess of love, for some life in his statue, and the goddess became sympathetic to the young artist's plight. Aphrodite turned the statue into a live woman. Pygmalion named the beautiful maiden Galatea, and the two were married. So this was the kind of second version of the theme that I shared with you. Now, what is George Bernard Shaw's philosophy? Although when we have now discussed his autobiography, when we have discussed his career as a writer, when we see his bent of towards the social issues where the status, class, education, poverty, they all play a very important role. We are already familiar with the kind of philosophy the writer would keep, being a writer of the modern era. However, let us see in detail what else do we have to know about the writer that will help us understand the drama in detail. Shaw says, "I must warn my readers that my attacks are directed against themselves, not against my stage figures." So what he presents on stage, what he presents in characters is not an attack on anything but on these characters himself, not as they are personified, but as they are carried by those personas. Shaw wanted to force his viewers to face the reality of unpleasant events. So these are the things that he would expect from the audience, and he would expect from his own work, his objectives to achieve, that he wanted to spread reality, an eye for reality. He wanted to provoke thinking. And he wanted to provoke thinking for the unpleasant events in society and the unpleasant events which were basically causing the social segregation and were resulting into the class segregation. So he promoted the unpleasant plays by publishing a long preface in which he could argue his views. He was the one who started with by giving prefaces to play, a long preface, and where he would prepare his audience for a kind of attention that he would want from them, the kind of attitude they would show to such writings. And it was a kind of a direct relation between the writer and the audience without the veil of the drama that he would later use to disguise the kind of emotions he keeps for the goods and bads. So basically it was a kind of relationship, the rapport he would make with his audience in order to prepare them for the kind of reality he's going to shock them with. Shaw was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 19 25. So a struggling writer of his own age who badly failed in writing fiction, and for a decade who could not earn more than few shillings a year, you can see him winning Nobel Prize of his time. Only when he could understand what his real strength is in. He continued to write until he was 94, until he finished his career. And now we see what is this Pygmalion effect. Basically, this Pygmalion is, as I discussed with you, I discussed two versions of myth with you. One is the original myth from that I discussed in the beginning. Then the little modern version of Pygmalion. Basically, the myth has an effect, and this effect is of self-fulfilling prophecy. How an object become fulfilling for oneself, and how this became one's object of total desire. And then we see how this Pygmalion effect can be understood in relevance with the play. I am discussing this now in the very beginning of the play, and I will again take you the similar kind of understanding towards the end of the play to see what kind of understanding you have developed. So, Pygmalion deals with our beliefs about ourselves. What we believe influences how we behave. That is what is the effect of the myth that was then adopted and adapted by the writer. And he believes in that what we believe influence our behavior. That means our behaviors depend very much on our beliefs. And then this aspect influences our action. Likewise, how we behave impacts what people think about us. So it's not only our beliefs, our actions, which are basically a kind of consequence of our beliefs, are then again a reflection of what people think about us or what people expect from us. And then it has an impact on others' belief as a kind of reaction. In turn, this affects how others behave towards us. And then this causes others' action. Ultimately, how they behave towards us reinforces what we believed ourselves in the first place. So basically it's a kind of circular activity that centrally focuses on our beliefs. So if thing has to be changed, it has to be our beliefs. If something has to be questioned, it has to be our beliefs. That is the effect of Pygmalion myth, and that is the stance and position that the writer takes in his writing. And this image has been adopted by the reference that is given in the bottom. So this overview of the things in the beginning make us start with the play, and we are going to start with the overview of the plot. So let us explore generally what is the story that we are going to deal with. And I tell you, it's a very interesting story. In this drama, George Bernard Shaw uses a lot of humor and lively characterization to explore how language, class structure, education, and gender segregation influence how people are seen by society, how people are treated by society, and how people form a society full of such social evils. However, what Shaw brings forward in his play is a lot of sugar coating with a lot of humor and entertainment. So after reading Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, you will find it not less than a treat, I tell you. And the two main characters of the play are Eliza Doolittle, a poor but proud flower girl with a Cockney accent, a way of speaking associated with the working class. This Cockney accent means the typical accent that would be kept by the working class people. And our protagonist is Eliza Doolittle, who is representative of the third level of the class, that is working class, the lowest level of the class. Working class who is not educated, the working class who is not privileged to even have access to necessities of life. This is our protagonist of the play, the first main character. Henry Higgins, an arrogant and insensitive linguistics professor, our second main character of the play. Somehow we can call him a protagonist too, because both of these characters cannot be without each other. Eliza Doolittle, the character is made up in coordination with Henry Higgins, and Henry Higgins cannot be understood if we are not able to understand Eliza Doolittle. So basically both of these characters are playing as protagonists, I would say, together. So Henry Higgins represents the upper class, the elite class of 20th century, who is a linguistic professor. That shows that he's considered as an authoritative power because he has education, and it's linguistic professor, the science of language that he knows as his qualification makes him even superior, because that would be, language is exercised in 20th century as a tool to separate these social status, the class status. So this person is a perfect kind of representation of that society that is elite in nature, that is upper class, that keeps hold of education, that keeps hold of language and exercises language as authority and power. And this status makes him insensitive and arrogant, two major characteristics of the time of the class, of the upper class, that this class is insensitive to humanity and very arrogant too. Alright, moving on, we see that Eliza comes to Higgins' house to ask him to give her speech lessons. Eliza is a poor flower girl who sells flour to keep her earnings, and one day she comes to Higgins' place to request him if he, being linguistics professor, could give her speech lessons. She wants to learn to speak properly so that she can get a job in a flower shop instead of selling flowers on the street. So we see a desire of lower class entering into the middle class. However, understanding language as the major segregating aspect, we find this character from the lower class wants to improve her speech so that she can have a respectable living and can work at a flower shop. Higgins decides to take the girl on as a professional challenge. Now, a girl who has never been to school, who has no education, who has no background, who has no civilized brought up, nothing at all. Higgins, being a professor of linguistics, decides to take this as a challenge to transform the girl into a kind of civilized lady. He boasts to his associate, that his friend Colonel Pickering, that with 6 months of lessons, Eliza could be passed off as a duchess. So this is the basic bet that is set between Colonel Pickering, Professor Higgins' friend, and Professor Higgins. And the object of the bet is a human being from low class who is not treated less than inhuman because she is just an object of experiment. And the bet is that in 6 months' time, Professor Higgins will transform a Cockney accent girl from a lower class into a sophisticated, civilized lady of elite class. only by giving her speech lessons. Well, so Higgins has Eliza move into his house. The story moves on with this, that he kind of accepts this challenge. However, this Eliza's request of asking him to give her lessons is very interesting, and I'm trying my best to, you know, bring you the kind of visuals that I would want to introduce. However, just to let you understand the story, she eventually she comes to his house and she stays there to let the bedtime go by, and the transformation starts there. With the help of Pickering and the housekeeper, Mrs. Pearce, he teaches Eliza the proper speech and manners of the upper class. Although Eliza wants to learn, there is tension between her and Higgins all the time. She also wants to be treated with respect as a human being, as a person, if nothing else. Higgins, however, persists in treating her just mere object of his experiment and an object. So we see that will Eliza and Henry Higgins become friends, or will their differences drive them apart? This is going to be a question of curiosity. If Higgins' experiment succeeds, where will Eliza grow from there? Will she be able to happily go back and join the flower shop that he intended to in the beginning? Or will she become a sophisticated lady to marry a sophisticated being? Or will she be a happy person because she's able to achieve what she wanted to? Will learning to speak like a duchess allow her to live like one? That is another question. So, with these three questions, now when I believe that you have started reading the play Pygmalion, you'll be able to read with the spectacles of these questions back in your mind. So let us have a look at the play, where we are trying to locate the characters, what role they are playing, what kind of relationships they are sharing with each other, what kind of conflicts and significance the drama keeps. Alright, so we see the character of Eliza Doolittle. Her role in the play is of protagonist. She is a poor flower girl who wishes to be rich and happy. And her relationship with Alfred, his father, is of daughter. She is object of experiment subject to Higgins and Pickering, and possibly means more to Higgins, that we will explore later. So what is the conflict? She cannot change her inner characteristics to suit the newly changed outer appearance. She argues with Higgins on this subject, and this becomes eventually the major conflict in the play. Significance attached to this role is able to stay true to herself and to not conform to please society. Alright. The second character is of Mr. Higgins, Professor Henry Higgins. The role he plays is of antagonist, basically, professor of phonetics, and tries to teach Eliza the proper ways of society, the manners of elite class. The relationships he keeps in the play is that he's friends to Higgins, wishes to be friends with Eliza, but only friends, later on though. And then the conflict. He tries to change Eliza's personality, but she won't let him. He also has a hard time understanding women. That is another one of the major clashes. Significance that his character keeps is his actions show that no one can change another's character. Alright. Then we see Colonel Pickering's role. He's another researcher of phonetics, and he's friends to Higgins and a friend to Eliza too. And the kind of conflict that he contributes in is that he's trying to get Eliza and Higgins to understand each other. So somehow he plays role of a bridge between these two characters, which are playing protagonist and antagonist. And he did not change his morals to suit Higgins' need. He's another kind of he's another character apart Eliza, who would not like to change his character for Higgins' sake. Then Mrs. Pearce, she's a motherly figure, and she's housekeeper at Higgins' place, and she's protector of Eliza and keeps Higgins in line. And she has trouble in trying to reason with Higgins because she's not that educated and she's not that good an orator. Yes, one very important thing is that Professor Henry Higgins is an excellent orator. So you can see some reflection of the writer's autobiography here. And she is a role model to Eliza. Eliza would want to be one like her. Then we have Freddy Hill. Freddy is an ideal image of a man at the time to Eliza. Eliza finds him a kind of ideal person. He has feelings for Eliza over time. They marry somehow, and then argues with the people of his society on his choice of Eliza. He gives hope to Eliza to move on. Then we have class representation. So what kind of class representation we have in the play? We find Higgins as an impatient, rude, confident, superior and self-important person representing elite class. We find a kind of conflicting mirror of Colonel Pickering as a kind, polite, generous gentleman who's enthusiastic, eager and confident, again representing elite class. And we find anxious, eager, emotional, enthusiastic, ambitious, however unsure character of Eliza as representation of working class. We can also find Colonel Pickering a figure of middle class who moved from middle class successfully and entered into the elite class. We find Eliza's character a representation of low class. Her behavior is respectful to people of higher class, and she has some specific language characteristics. She calls gentlemen sir and cap in our caption, which is a compliment. Henry Higgins' representation of, in fact, middle class, behavior rude and patronizing to lower class, polite to same or upper class. He's not from the very elite class. He can also be categorized into middle class or kind of higher middle class. He calls Eliza, you silly girl, and Pickering, my dear man, and equal and friendship. Then we have Colonel Pickering, a kind of upper class representation. His behavior is generally confident and polite, but ignores Eliza. Language is prepared to begin a conversation with Henry, whom he does not know, generous with praise to him. And you can see a kind of transformation of Eliza, a poor little girl, into a sophisticated lady, duchess. And the themes and the major conflicts that we are going to study in this play. Major conflicts is a status divide, gender relations, self-consciousness, social snobbery. The major conflicts, one major conflict is of status divide that I shared with you. And the nature of this class structure here, we are told in the story, is the basically divide of three classes: upper class, middle class and lower working class. In upper class you will find Higgins, Colonel Pickering, Mrs. Higgins, Mrs. Claire and Freddy and Hill. In middle class, you will also find Mrs. Pearce. She does not, however, represent middle class morality alone. In many ways, that is also a quality of Higgins and Colonel Pickering's class. So it's basically the middle class and upper class that you will see in this play is a combination, is a kind of mixture of both classes. Lower working class, however, stands alone, and Eliza, Eliza Doolittle, and is never seen but often discussed and heard about wife and Eliza's stepmother are people who are representing this class. Then you have a vast gulf between the poor and even the lower upper class. So it's not only three class segregation. There are again the lower middle, the lower upper class and the high upper class, the lower class and high lower class. So again segregations inside segregations. Higgins' cast off change is a fortune to Eliza, who assumes later that he must have been drunk. Eliza's belief that riding in a taxi is the ultimate badge of upper class quality of life, and that is why she uses cab when she is to drive to Higgins' place to request him to teach him speech lessons. And then you have what kind of gender relationships and differences that we are going to study in this play is that the relationship between genders, men and women. No, you two indefinitely stupid male creatures. Who says that? That's a question to you. Then we have gender discrimination, and that is promoted by a few characters. Neither Colonel Pickering nor Henry Higgins have a clue about the situation they are putting Eliza or themselves into. It's not only changing an object of experiment. It's not only changing one characteristics into another person. It's about transforming an entire personality of one person. And how can and it's not only an person who object and subject coming together into an experiment, it's the doer and the being done, and their genders play important role into this as well. Mrs. Pearce recognizes that Higgins is immorally using the power granted him by his patriarchal culture to pressure Eliza, a pressure which, if she gives in, could lead her to a life of wickedness. Well, she's a kind of sensible character in the play. And then you see a conflict of self-consciousness. Who becomes self-aware? Who becomes self-conscious? In fact, all of these characters, they develop into self-conscious being towards the end of the play. Self-perception, however, is mainly related with Eliza's character. Eliza's sense of worth. She's infected with a lie. Alright. Eliza's learned that women in the upper classes, in fact, do not have the independence that women of the lower classes do. Why would she say that? Why would she feel that? They must be connected to a man in some way to be respectable within middle class morality. So apparently it is called upper class, however they are the same as the middle class morality is. Then they need a man to let them understand that they are independent. Eliza rejects being a gold digger, and Higgins rejects female puppy dog tricks. Now, how are we able to relate this to the story? That is another question I'm posing on to you. Only a working skill frees Eliza, and that is Eliza's eventual self-awareness and self-consciousness that he gets to achieve in the end. So the major conflicts is of self-consciousness. Eliza has a powerful sense of her value. I'm a good girl, I am, and you will keep on listening to these dialogues throughout the play. Therefore, she will never become a kept woman, not even by Henry Higgins, who she respects a lot. She has ambition, willing to give up 2/3 of her daily income to improve herself. That is her ambitious ambition and her enthusiastic nature. But she's infected with class prejudice. Put the girls in their place just a bit. You are going to allow yourself to marry that low-born woman? That is the class prejudice shown in this character. So basically all the characters are shown a kind of limited objects and subjected to the class characteristics. And then social snobbery. What kind of social snobbery and what kind of snobbish attitudes we find in representative of all these classes? Eliza's struggle is of significance, has to play a major role here. She is to work at a flower shop. She's infected by social snobbery herself. She discovers that a rise in culture means a loss of independence, however, as does her stepmother. Eventually, she achieves independence. How does she do that? That we will explore. Probably the most important conflict in the play is the class system is Eliza's primary antagonist. So basically, this theme is personified in the character of Professor Henry Higgins. So what we did in today's talk, basically, we in the very first in the lecture, we tried to conclude our drama from the Theatre of the Absurd, Waiting for Godot by Samuel Barclay Beckett, and then we started with our next writer of the modern times, modern drama, and that is George Bernard Shaw, and we are studying his play written by George Bernard Shaw, Pygmalion. We tried to explore a little into the detail what Pygmalion is made of, and for that sake we got into the myth behind the play. Then we explored the contextual background of the play, that it is meant in 20th century and written in 20th century, focusing on London, England. And then we understood the George Bernard Shaw's philosophy of life that we can also find in his writings. We had a plot overview. We tried to go through the characters, the role they are playing, relationships they are bound in, conflicts and significance of the play, and we also slightly struggled with the themes and the major conflicts in the play, hoping that we will be able to explore them in detail in our coming talks. And I'm sure that when I meet you next time, you will be done with your first reading of Pygmalion and you will find it quite interesting. So this was all for today. I will now see you in lecture 22. That is going to be in detail exploration of George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion. Allah Hafiz.